2, 1. I have a lot to say, so let's get right into it. What's the counterfactual we think that's likely in a world where these companies do not have advertising-based models? I think there's 5 points on this. The first thing is they probably have subscription-based models. Obviously, they still need to make money. They still need to repeatedly be paying them, they'll make profits, probably looks like fees or whatever, that kind of thing. Secondly, I think basically what we would prefer is like when companies originate, they choose that model instead. They can potentially do a kind of thing where they like are free for a while, like capture part of the market share, and then eventually start charging the fee. I think a lot of companies would like to do this. That's really fine. Third thing, I think we just hope this would start when the internet like kind of started to become a major factor in our lives. So like kind of throughout the like modern history of the internet, instead of like shifting towards pretty much all companies being advertising models, instead they have subscription fees. Fourthly, I think this probably would operate something kind of like cable, like you might be able to have like an internet package where you get like some Google, some Instagram, whatever, but it's also probably not like a massive like prohibitive fee. It's probably their goal was to have like still lots of subscribers. It's probably not going to be like $1,000 a month to like Google things. I think that would be a bit preposterous. Last kind of framing here, I think 2 things are probably likely in terms of how the world looks different on our side of the house. So either I think these corporations didn't probably get as large because probably just be more competition in general, or I think they're just as big but with different incentives. We're willing to defend I think either version of this world. I'll welcome to decide which one they think is more likely. Alright, let's talk about the key incentives that an advertising-based model gives you and why those incentives are necessarily pernicious and create a lot of the harms we see in the status quo and will be replaced by better incentives with subscription-based models. There are 3 key incentives to advertiser-based models, right? The first one is harvesting and selling data. This is literally how advertising works, right? You need to have a lot of information about your people using your service so you can sell them the most targeted ads, get the most returns for your clients. Second one is keeping you online longer. And the third one is more clicks and engagement. This is how you actually are able to like see more ads, engage with more things, get more data on Google, those kind of things. Those are the 3 incentives. The new incentives, if you have a subscriber-based model, is really replaced, I think, just by generally getting subscribers. And this, in whichever way you basically like want to do, like accumulate, like have the best quality content, whatever this kind of looks like. But you necessarily reduce the incentives I talked about before because you're not getting more per like individual person based on their engagement or their data. You're paying probably a flat fee, which doesn't change based on how the person interacts with your site. All right. There's a myriad of harms that this advertiser-based model creates that we've seen in status quo that are really severe, and I'm going to try and be really clear about why I think these are so problematic. The first one has to do with the idea of the harvesting of your data and privacy. 3 important reasons why you can't, as a consumer, meaningfully protect yourself from any kind of data harvesting and privacy that happens in the status quo. First one is like no meaningful consent when you like check off that like terms and conditions. We don't know what the hell that means. Like all of us just click the box, right? This has literally been like ruled upon in court, so like it's physically impossible for an individual person to like even just read and take in the kind of like privacy data you agree to on the status quo. It would literally take like a year to read the terms and conditions that an average person agrees to in a year. I don't think people are actually meaningfully giving away their privacy or their data when they sign up for these places. Not to mention, I think a lot of these sites become so ubiquitous and like necessary for everyday living. I don't think it's reasonable to say someone opted to using Google in a world where it's functionally almost impossible to not use Google in the status quo. Second thing is that like legislation just doesn't really keep up. It's really slow. Technology evolves really fast. Legislation is very slow. And thirdly, this company has a lot of lobbying power to limit like any kind of like, protections on privacy and data harvesting. Why is this so bad? 2 reasons. First one is just a massive violation of your privacy. I think we're just going to happily defend the like basic intuition that some privacy, not having like constant like surveillance state and like Big Brother looking at you is probably important. But really crucially, the problem here especially is that you don't even know the extent to which your privacy is being violated. You don't know how much of your data is being mined by these companies or in what way, what it'll be used for, and therefore there's no way you can protect yourself other than just like becoming a hermit and going off the grid. It's just not really feasible. The second, the harm is that this data is also sold to like people who might use it for nefarious purposes, right? Things like police forces, like things like people who might use it against you, use it to like manipulate your political views, all sorts of things. Like that's really harmful too. I'll take the POI from Bobo before I move on.
Yeah, so corporations want data on consumers on either side of the house anyway, so what exactly is the difference between the two?
Sure, even a marginal reduction in the incentive to collect your data is good, I think, and a marginal amount more privacy is good, but we tell you they're going to have to prove what people are going to do with that data that's more like likely on their side of the house when their primary goal right now is selling that data to advertisers to like increase their like targeted ads. I think it's way less likely on their side of the house. Even if it's marginal, it's a win on our side of the house. They're going to have to do more than just mitigate that harm. Alright, time spent and engagement, why is this a problem? Essentially what happens is the key thing you do as a website is you want to show people increasingly sensational and controversial content to keep them interested and keep them on your website as long as possible so they can see more ads. I think this leads to 4 separate harms that are really problematic. The first one's just like basic social media and internet addiction. Like this is a real thing. It's like actually documented in like mental health studies. Like just the fact that your phone is like constantly on you and pinging and stuff like that. It's like genuinely really hard to ignore thing, and it creates like a real impact on your life in terms of things like mental health, even just like basic FOMO of like there's always something going on that I could be like a part of on the internet that I can't possibly keep up with. That's concerning. Second thing is obviously just things like rabbit holes. Like they show you more and more extreme content to keep you interested. Once you get like used to a baseline of something, the only way to keep you interested and engage with the content is to like level up the extremism. And so it's how you get a lot of this like misinformation, clickbait, those sorts of things. The fourth one is like sensationalization of news. I think specifically this is harmful when you feel like news content has to constantly be engaging and gravitating. That's why you get that kind of like sensationalist sensation. I'll take you over.
So this argument is just that social media is bad, but this seems in tension with the claim you made earlier, which is that people have every incentive to use these services on either side of the house.
Yeah, so it's not that social media is bad, it's that advertiser-driven model is bad. I've been really clear why you wouldn't have the same amount of engagement pressure on our side of the house. They're going to have to engage with that mechanism. That's just not like responsive to my material at all. Last thing is fake news. Obviously, fake news can be always more exciting than real news because real news is often pretty dry and boring. So you're always going to have more like sensationalized content and fake news. It's just more exciting. It keeps people clicking and watching. Okay, what are the massive political harms, I think, of these things other than the just obvious ones of like it's pretty messed up to have like false information and be addicted to social media? First of all, a lot of that sold data can be used to actively manipulate you. We saw this in the Cambridge Analytica scandal where like it was literally just like your data was used in nefarious ways to like specifically get people to vote in different ways. Like obviously like Russian hackers is like a whole other thing. Brexit, there's like a million examples I think of ways that like if your data is harvested specifically to get you to achieve a political goal you would not otherwise do. But I think we also see a massive amount of radicalization and polarization. And this just gets thrown around in debates a lot, but it's genuinely a massive impact on like the ability for democracy to function, and I don't think opposition can hand wave away at this. Because of this heightened level of content and discourse and like misinformation, it's genuinely hard for voters to still function in a democracy when you have things like 32% of Americans who believe the election was stolen from Donald Trump. It's genuinely hard for like basic systems and states to function when you have that heightened level of misinformation, heightened level of extremism and content on your feeds. This is not a minor impact. It's not just like, it's too bad that people are polarized or radicalized. It's genuinely a crisis of like people being able to access accurate information and those kinds of things, and you constantly have pressures to make that information more sensational and more ridiculous, not to mention all the privacy claims that we've proven to you. I think those are really important impacts that OP's going to have to meaningfully engage with and tell you why removing those incentives would make the world significantly better. Really proud to propose.
I thank you for that speech and call upon the Leader of Opposition.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the clash from opening opposition will be simple. We think that this business model is not only good for consumers, but it improves corporate incentives writ large, and it equalizes the political sphere, even if polarization occurs. But secondly, I think it's reasonable for us to assume current protections in the status quo, like data privacy, data protection, and the ability of corporations or social media accounts to be held accountable if their negative effects happen. That's why we help people like Facebook in trial. Before I move on to my 3 cases on consumers, corporations, and politics, 3 very short points of rebuttal. First, on all of their arguments on how they create negative key incentives, such as harvesting and selling data, keeping people online for longer, and like more clicks and engagement. One, this is not mutually exclusive. All of these big internet companies still have the incentive to accumulate more data from people because this is how they understand to get more people on their subscription-based platforms. But secondly, more importantly, we think that they still have the incentive to keep people addicted, keep people hooked in it so that they continue to subscribe for the next month. Even if the fee is so low, like a $5 fee, that is still a thing that people do not want to pay for if it is not worth it. If Facebook is boring, if Instagram doesn't show you the nice pictures or the nice memes in the very first place. Those key incentives still exist, so all of their harms still accrue on their side. Secondly, on why data harvesting is bad, because there's no meaningful choice that people opt into it. No, thank you. 2 responses to why this is false. One, people are cognizant of the fact that they're going to be publicly exposed when they sign up for a public platform. That's why even if you put your account to private on Facebook, you can still search, you can still be knowledgeable, people can still search for you in the very first place. But secondly, people want this kind of reasonable transaction. They're willing to give up their privacy because it connects them to more social groups. It connects them to products that they might not know of. It connects them to political groups that they can join on in the very first place. But secondly, it's symmetric on their side. There is still an incentive to harvest data, and I would argue, if they cannot sell it to corporations, they would sell it to governments, they would sell it to police forces. So all of the harms exist still on their side. Lastly, on the sensationalization of media, fake news, and addiction. One, this is just a flaw of the traditional media system and just a flaw of political groups in general. There is no structural analysis as to why social media amplifies this. We will argue on later on that this is the only way, or this public advertising model is the only way to mitigate a lot of the harmful institutional incentives that exist. Let's go to the first argument. Why is this advertising model good for people and consumers? But before I move on, sure, closing.
All the reasoning that you just gave about why is it that people will always opt for social media, wouldn't it still exist on our world if it's a subscription-based model?
Yeah, they will still go to do all of these things and still do all of the harmful bad things. I will argue why algorithmic kind of advertising and targeted advertising is good for consumers. The simple framing here is this. Online and targeted advertising contribute to the creation of products and services that would not get to people or that would not be created in the very first place. Why is this good for consumers? I think one, algorithms reveal preferences that even the people do not know of. But secondly, we think targeted advertising allows people to have the wider option of the different kinds of products that they want. But thirdly, people are connected to smaller corporations that are likely to be able to give them these kinds of services. What am I talking about? I'm talking about things like plus-size clothing. I'm talking about things such as queer makeup that only developed the market when Facebook was able to connect to these smaller corporations and cater to these minorities or cater to these consumers that needed and wanted these products. The problem on their side is that all corporations, not just big tech firms, will assume what people want and assume demand and impose certain standards on things like body standards and weight, and we think that's incredibly harmful. That's why the market is significantly more diverse on our side and significantly more efficient and gives more to people the products that they need and they want. But secondly, why do corporations have an incentive to develop this stuff, further mechanizing this point? We think, one, the prior conception of all of this subscription-based business strategy is the ability of corporations to impose standards of what they want. But secondly, and more importantly, now they have the active data, now they have the active information to cater to these kinds of preferences. But thirdly, we think smaller corporations now are more competitive because they can fill in these gaps and niches in the market, and this is informed on them by Google, Facebook, and Instagram. But fourthly, even if larger corporations take up this market and prevent competition and some form of monopolization, this is perfectly fine because it grants them it grants these people these kinds of goods that they deserve. Why then is this a fair trade-off, even if people give up some violation of privacy? We think, one, even if you don't know the full extent as to how your data is being used, it's perfectly alright. There is no significant offense. I don't think people are really feeling sketchy about this. But secondly, and more importantly, I think it's a reasonable and fair transaction for all of the reasons that I just mentioned. But before I move on, opening.
Yeah, so you said there's been recourse or government accountability. What exactly has Facebook faced after they fueled the genocide in Yemen?
I think a lot of things like legal costs, the fact that they have limited operations and everything else. There's so many regulations that prevent them from committing the worst crimes. Secondly, how does this improve corporate incentives or incentives of these big tech corporations? They were right to point out that they will have paywalls and subscription-based models. But why is this inherently exclusive and why is this necessarily bad? We think regardless of how low the price is, you are likely to incentivize or likely to push out lower income individuals because they do not feel that this is a necessary good for them. But secondly, more importantly, even if this is untrue, even if it is true that everyone wants to get into these social media or big internet platforms, even if Google is an absolute need, what's likely going to happen is that they're going to generate higher tiers of subscription, privileging rich people within these platforms even better. We think that this is worse because this excludes people from information. This is worse because this excludes people from interaction compared to our side where you can have access to multiple groups, multiple Facebook markets and the like, and we think that this is far more egalitarian and far better. That's why corporate incentives are more equal on our side. Moving on to the last argument. Why is then political advertising good? And this is a response to polarization. I think polarization will exist on our side, and maybe it is true that it sometimes amplifies these kinds of things. But I think there are two key benefits that exist with this kind of targeted business model. We think, one, it serves as a platform to galvanize minority opinions and minority groups. I think it is the only way for people in queer communities and conservative societies to connect with other political groups and candidates. I think this is the only way for racial minorities to be be able to find out about different kinds of political groups that support them. Because Facebook shows them these things on their first feed in the very first place. We think that this is good because it allows them to compete with the majority opinion, but secondly, it competes with a lot of traditional news media advertisements or traditional news media portrayal of things like political issues. That's why it's an equalizing factor. But secondly, I think it democratizes the access to politics in the very first place. It is significantly easier to access these groups. It's significantly easier to message these groups because Facebook and Instagram give you access to them, give you their kinds of links and everything else. That's why politics is not only fairer on our side, even if there's some polarization, but there's significantly more participation and significant more access. For all these reasons and more, the motion falls. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the DPM.
Just before we begin, quick point on accessibility. Please just nonverbal POIs, just put your hand up. I promise I'll take one from each team, but no verbal interjections really throws me off. Thank you.
Also, if you want to put the podium back up, you can feel free to
That's
do
a
so
great
if you'd
idea.
like.
Yeah, sorry.
Is that yours?
Three, two, one. The first thing I want to note off the top of the round is this is going to be a debate to some extent on the margins of how much incentives shift, things like that. But note that does not make it low impact. When these companies affect billions of people worldwide, a small shift in incentive literally means the difference between whether or not a government is toppled, whether or not people, like millions of people may face mental health issues, these types of things. So note that this is going to be a debate on the margins, but it is not going to be a low impact debate because even a slight change to the incentives is going to have massive impacts down the line. So with that, I want to give with some direct rebuttal, then I'll get into more of my stuff. I'm going to kind of give you some more weighing on the different worlds, why our incentives are better, why subscription-based model, while not perfect, has better incentives than the comparative, and where this manifests in different parts of the world, specifically talking about like developed world and then developing world, why we think we win in impacts in both those areas. So quickly though, let's start with what they tell you. The first thing is we get a lot of like, that's not mutually exclusive. One, we think it's just marginally more likely that you have better incentives on our side. So one, why are you less likely to sell the data? First thing, they say if you can't sell to companies, you'll sell to governments. Cool, literally Google and Facebook already do this. They sell to police services all the time. So it's unclear why that's like their comparative. I think probably they just continue to do that. Note they're defending status quo. I'm not gonna make them like rewrite all of history, just like I don't think that's fair for us to have to do since like the 90s or whatever when things, but note that let's talk about the broad incentives, what they were probably more likely to do. I think again, when your entire generation is selling data, you're probably gonna do it more likely. I actually think Apple is a really good example where they made a part of their brand will protect your privacy. I think a lot of companies would be more likely to do that. One, because they're going to have to differentiate between their competitors. So if like Bing comes out and says, we promise never to sell your data, they might actually be able to break into the market instead of just being like shitty knockoff Google at the moment, right? And I think there's important things that companies would be more likely, again, incentivized to do on our side because they aren't reliant on that. Google has no reason to do that because it doesn't really matter if they lose a couple subscribers if they can still sell all that data. On our side, all you care about is keeping your subscribers. And no, it doesn't matter how many times someone clicks on Google if they pay a monthly fee. You just want them. You're actually probably then far more incentivized to not have them burn out all the time, not constantly like inundated, not have mental health issues. You probably just care about making them sure they stick around long enough to resubscribe or literally not cancel the subscription because let's be honest, they all do the simple thing where they say like, input your credit card, we'll keep charging you every month until you tell us not to. It's not like you have to opt in every month. That's like literally basic subscription model. So all you have to do, that is a reason I'm going to tell you that they're far less likely to want to be involved with scandals because guess what? It's a whole lot easier to feel feel less complicit in like bad action when you're just like on Facebook, but I don't pay anything. I wasn't complicit in the problems of Facebook versus literally giving Facebook money every month. I know this may not be a meaningful distinction in our minds, but it is to consumers where they feel how involved they are with these different companies. Let's keep talking about what's going to happen on opposition side. So the first thing I want to say is that they also then tell you that there's like public exposition. I think this is just like patently ridiculous. Let's be very clear. If anyone thinks in this round that Google and Facebook have really been held accountable, I don't know what to tell you. Like they literally run democracies in a lot of instances. They have the GDP of like more than most developed nations. It's very unclear why they are going to be held accountable in the ways they tell you, specifically in the developing world, which I'll get to more in my extension, but no. Then we get this idea that like you get great consumer benefits. First of all, note that we think probably just the impacts broadly, like literally just the consequences, are worse on our side. So even if you don't buy the privacy point at all, we're still going to win. But I actually think the privacy point is really important, one, because people don't meaningfully consent, but also the trade-off I don't think is actually worth it. One, I don't think queer makeup was like invented because of the internet and Facebook. I think probably the queer communities have been doing that for a while. I'm pretty sure like pictures of Stonewall have people with makeup on. I don't see why that's like the shift. Also this like, I think pretty patently ridiculous idea that like, oh, this is better for plus size people. You know what's probably been the biggest threat to plus size people is constant inundation on Instagram telling them they're lesser than because they don't have like the perfect slim body, right? I don't think it's probably super helpful for them to be like, oh, I can buy a t-shirt, but guess what? It doesn't really matter because I'm constantly inundated and I hate myself more. I think the comparison of their model, we are constantly being told to sign on because guess what? Instagram doesn't care if you hate yourself when you're on their site as long as you're on their site. So if you're addicted and forced to go in there, even if it's for things that are against your own mental health, they don't care. But you're probably more likely to not subscribe to something in the future if it continues to hurt you. You have better incentives to keep people on in a healthy amount because all you need to do is pay the fee, not be on literally all the time. Before I continue, open meeting if you want to defend any of that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Google and Facebook are still going to be powerful and can still manipulate governments on either side of the world. So isn't it better that they still use this influence to achieve like consumer preferences?
Absolutely. So I think what more likely they're going to do to manipulate governments is probably like so that you don't get antitrust laws on them, that will probably happen. What they're unlikely to do is like take down privacy laws because they don't rely on that to make all their money, right? They're less likely to care about, they're less likely to like lobby against bills against polarization and fake news because again, that's not their business model. In fact, they're probably going to stop fake news more because they don't want to be literally known as the one of the options out of many that you subscribe to that's being peddling a bunch of damage. So let's talk about the different contexts because I think this is super important. Again, this incentive analysis. What happens in the developing world, right? Or developed world? All the things my partner tells you, so massive destabilization of democracy, right? Literally the fact that some people don't believe in elections anymore is probably a pretty big impact, probably a lot more than whether or not you can buy like, you know, your dog walker perfect thing in the color you want or like the specific type of t-shirt. I think note that that's the comparison they're giving you is like marginal increases in consumer satisfaction, plus, not to mention, mass misinformation, which just has like health benefits. Note that millions of people have died worldwide because they didn't believe in COVID or didn't believe in those type of things, which were peddled by large social media groups because guess what? It's a lot better to get engagement of people like who believe the government's against them than like a really boring CDC article on like why COVID is like dangerous but probably not like a government conspiracy. Those are the types of incentives. Back half, go ahead please.
So all of the bad things you say tech companies do aren't actually tied in principle to getting more ad revenue, right? There are things that they do precisely because they do increase engagement, which is the same reason why they would increase subscription fees on your side of the house.
No, because why would, like, for example, if you're subscribed once a month, it's unclear why I need to be on there literally all the time, right? As long as I pay the fee. And in fact, you have a reason to deter them from burnout, i.e. if they stay on too long, how many of us have taken a break from Facebook or Instagram? That is terrible to their subscription model, so you probably incentivize them not to do that. You probably have like checks where it says, hey, you've really been on this app a really long time, maybe take a break. Probably those types of things, they want you to keep paying once a month. Instead of, literally, it doesn't matter to them if you have the same amount of interaction in 1 month or over a year, they get the same amount of money, so if you burn out, repeat, come back, it's probably good for them. Let's talk about the developing world. Some of this is already being integrated, or developing world, I think it's super important. One, literally magnitudes of harms that I don't think any amount of consumer protection or consumer benefits are ever going to touch. Literally, we're talking about funding genocides in some countries, massive information, ethnic cleansing, these types of things. All the things that happen in developing world, more destabilization, all these types of things. But no, less accountability fundamentally. Two key reasons. One, they're far more powerful than a lot of these governments. They have way more money, way more influence. But also, I hate to tell you, Western voters don't really care nearly as much about people in other countries as they do in their own country. So if they have to choose between like holding Facebook accountable for something that happened to them or holding Facebook accountable for genocide in another country, they'll always preference themselves, meaning the accountability, which is already low, is extremely less. Very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the DLO.
be very clear on what the counterfactual opening government is defending is. Because even under their world of a subscription-based model, corporations want to know things about you. That is, they want to know when they spend their time online because they want to know what their subscribers are like. They want to know what kinds of contents you like and what kind of content you're likely to be involved with because they want you to subscribe the next month. They want to know when do people quit and when are people likely to take some time off from social media because that is the thing that links them into their revenue. What that then means is that there's literally no meaningful difference in the level of privacy violation that happens. Because maybe they're not trying to sell other goods to you, but they're still trying to sell goods to you, i.e. their own service, on the basis of collecting data on behalf of you. So the margin of difference that opening government is going for is extremely, extremely small in the round. The second thing I want to note on this speech, though, is that when opening government says that people need to, in a subscription-based model, it's more likely that, oh, you want to prevent things like burnout, etc., etc. The problem is they don't explain why it is the case that that is the primary consideration of corporations. That is, on behalf of social media corporations, they want to do the thing that gets individuals hooked and gets individuals constantly subscribing with the least amount of cost that goes into it. It takes a lot of time and money to understand what is the extent to which individuals are going to get hooked. What is the extent to which, when do people take time off due to burnout? The easiest thing to do is, as they themselves acknowledge, to just inundate, flood individuals with data and flood individuals with sensationalized news. So therefore, that's also not going to change under their side of the house. Opening government does not have any material in the round anymore. The second thing I want to talk about then is in terms of consumers. I want to first, I first want to talk about the privacy violation stuff that they talk about, even though I've already defeated that. The other claim I want to make here is that the margin of harm is really, really unclear under their side. Because let's assume their best case scenario, corporations stop collecting their data altogether. The problem is that there are still governments that collect your data. You're already exposed to every other person knowing about what your stance and position in society is. That's just the nature of modern society, not social media advertising models in general. So that means that the additional harm that I face as a result of that privacy violation is unclear. Because maybe there's some privacy violation that exists, but that additional level of privacy violation is not quantified by opening government. And I want to claim that that additional violation is really small. Because if you understand that people already know all of your actions, then one other actor knowing your actions isn't going to be that meaningful or impactful in the round. But secondly, I don't think they meaningfully weigh the privacy claim against a host of benefits that Maddie gave you. That is, the claim that we made from opening opposition is extraordinarily simple. That is, people understand that sometimes their privacy is violated, but individuals choose to make the trade-off in terms of I prefer certain things to be free, or I prefer that I be able to use social media services, and therefore I am willing to trade my privacy off. I understand sometimes this is going to be coercive to some extent. The meaningful difference is opening government and GovBench in general forces this decision on every single individual. That is, each individual cannot make a choice because you cannot trade off your privacy for better products under their side. Whereas under our side, that level of choice exists on behalf of individuals. That's the difference between the two teams. Before I go on further, I'll take OG.
Yeah, so even if the privacy access to information was symmetrical, which it's not, we have incentives to use that to just make sure you come back. Your incentives are to make you addicted and be on there all month. Those are fundamentally still different incentives for what you do with that data.
No, the claim that I'm making is that corporations will take the easy way out. That is, get people hooked even under your side. I then want to weigh this in terms of why things like access to products is better on top of the choice claim. Because even if individuals were not making a choice, they don't really quantify the harms of privacy violation. Do I feel bad? What exactly is the impact of that? Whereas under our side, the fact that people can access goods that they wouldn't have been able to access before is actually a tangible change in the lives of individuals. I also want to additionally add that corporations are able to do provide even more useful products for free to individuals. This debate is not just about can I be on Facebook or not? It's even stuff like people being able to use Google Maps for free. That kind of relies on the revenue model of Google is able to provide this for free. And this is of profound utility to a lot of individuals. That's the whole thing that the entire GovBench is missing. I want to be clear on what the counterfactual is though. Because I think a good gov would probably make the claim that a good gov response to the argument that Maddie has given you is the idea that people don't want to buy these products anyway. But the counterfactual is that due to the nature of capitalism, people want to sell products anyway. The question is, what kinds of products are people going to be selling? The argument Maddie gives you is that the kinds of products that people are indoctrinated into buying are at least going to be more palatable to their needs. Secondly, I want to argue that oftentimes under their side, corporations would make assumptions about what you like as individuals. That is like things like a lot of corporations do this thing where like they would put different ads on the basis of like which racial groups lived in this particular community, and they make racial assumptions about like what individuals are likely to like. That happens less under their side, less under our side, because it's catered to the individual preferences. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
If it's true that capitalistic ideals means that people likely buy stuff through indoctrination, then wouldn't them also subscribe or opt into a subscription-based model based on the capitalistic ideal?
Yeah, so the capitalistic ideal exists on both sides. Under your side, they buy things that they don't want. Under our side, they buy things that are more in line with what they want. Then we talk about how like you get more access to goods and how there's innovation. The Gov claim generally here is that people have been doing things like innovating services or products for queer individuals, for instance, for a long time, and therefore people still get these products. The problem is that that does not scale. Yes, some individuals have been developing these kinds of things before. The meaningful difference is that advertising allows the level of scalability that happens only under our side. Finally, I want to talk about the political stuff that they talk about. Firstly, in terms of their claims on like how Facebook funds genocide in the developing world, like I genuinely don't think this is an issue of advertising. This is an issue of like people posting fake news and Facebook not being able to censor that. That has nothing to do with advertising. But secondly, I actually want to flip the argument, because we would argue that the reason why Facebook is able to do things like spend money on getting translators to read news in Myanmar and make sure that the kinds of fake news is censored is because they have more resources to do this. In a world in which their revenue decreases, as Maddie has told you, and they do not respond, Facebook does not have the capacity to do that in the developing world anymore. Finally, in terms of radicalization, I want to be very clear. Politicians have an incentive to radicalize individuals anyway, and particularly in a world of a subscription-based model, because different people are on different subscription outlets. Things like echo chambers and things like radicalization is actively worse under their side, because you no longer try to target the demographics that do not belong in your in-group. That meaningfully changes under our side when you try to target as many individuals as possible and get people politically motivated. We think this is at least slightly better for minorities. Extremely, extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech and call on the member of government.
We have to stop doing this. Oh. Three extensions from site closing opposition. I'll first discuss why is it that the overall social media experience for users is better on our side. Second, the whole issue of accountability and punishment, directly engaging with opening opposition. Third, why is it that we think that this model is the best model to break the monopoly of social middle houses existing in status quo? Let's go on to the first thing. How does this increase the overall social media experience to users? So no, a lot of this analysis here is going to deal with the entire idea about algorithms and targeted advertisement, which site opening opposition posit as a net good. I think site opening Gov has talked about why it's not a net good, but we talk about why is it that this would exist and it's better on our world. So the first thing to note, the major difference that exists when you move away from a advertisement-based model to a subscription-based model is that your customer now is the users itself. In an advertisement-based model, the main customer for the social media houses is not the user in of itself, but it is the advertisement group, because they make money from the advertisement group in of itself. So the moment you shift from a advertisement-based model to a subscription-based model, that's when the incentive structures of these individuals move towards the customers in of itself. I think that's the first primary difference here. But what are the impacts of this? So the first thing to note, that all of these algorithms you speak of and targeted advertisement will still exist on both worlds because of the characterization of OO-gate. We will take them at their best. But the difference here is that the content that is generated towards you and the content that is given towards you is not dictated by these corporations. In status quo, as much as you want to click hide advertisement, there's only a maximum hide advertisement button you can access, because Nike and Adidas and like all of these corporations to say you can't hide all of the advertisements because we are the ones paying you. So the final control exists on the aspect of this corporation. But the moment you shift this, that's when these individuals would have that power. The whole idea about the primary consideration that opening opposition talked about does not stay within the same users the way they want to posit because of these power dynamics that exist. But the change here is that you now get a lot more of a choice. If site opening opposition wants to talk about minority houses, minority business, plus side model clothes, you won't have this in their world when you have things like Adidas or any other big corporation blocking out, saying that you must prioritize our content over their content. So in a world that is subscription-based model, you can choose, you can talk about what is it that the content you want. It's not just algorithms feeding it to you, but you have more of a choice about what is it that you want to subscribe to. The best example to this is YouTube, because I think people are talking a lot of examples, but YouTube moved away from an advertisement-based model to a subscription-based model. We talk about YouTube Premium, which is why you don't only block out advertisements, but you get to curate the type of content that you want to get. It's not just fed down your throat like Facebook. And I think that's a good example about how is it that you get to break all of these things, right? Because the incentive structures that exist in status quo is there's no transactionary relationship between the user and the social media company. There's only a transactionary relationship between the social media company and the corporation, which is the biggest incentive structure that makes it very difficult for us to move on from this. But then the third part to this, there's an entire part on your speech about how is it people won't subscribe or you block out poorer people. I think this is untrue. A lot of the analysis are counterintuitive towards themselves. Because if they see that social media is so big, people always want to subscribe. The best example to this is dating apps. So you have things like Grindr and Tinder which give you a free access, so you can swipe to a certain extent, but at some point you can no longer swipe. That means people will subscribe to it because people want to access these things. It's important to them. And it's untrue for you to say that poorer communities cannot access it. It is as accessible. So perhaps in a subscription-based model, social media will adopt the same way as any and all of these dating apps, where there's a free version, there's a paid subscription version, and that's where they'll make money, which is why they'll block out all of the harms that exist within social media. If you want to picture this, imagine Tinder Premium, Facebook Premium. I think that's the best example that I can give you, right? So I think the conclusion to this, if side opening opposition once talks about content is better generated towards the individual users on side government, not on side opposition. Sit down. Second issue on accountability and punishment. So there's a deadlock in opening exchange. Everyone is throwing words. Oh, privacy is being sold, information is being sold, fake news is a thing. Yeah, sure, all of these things exist. But what is the incentive structures of social media houses right now? So in status quo right now, the primary consideration is trying to make money and businesses from these advertisement companies. Which is why whenever there's a data leak and etc., it doesn't affect them because it affects the users and that's not their customer. But the moment you change the incentive structure, so all of the things about how we can hold Facebook more accountable happens on our side when there is a transactionary nature between the users and the social media companies. That's when users can hold social media companies accountable. They are paying customers and they have a right for legal battle against the individual. Instead of go sit down, Facebook can just say, these are in your contract, read it, we can sell all this information. But it can no longer exist in a subscription-based model because all of these loopholes that exist for Facebook to run away from legal battles disappear because now the actual customers is the users in of itself. So the incentive to block more fake news, to make sure that it is translated to different languages, to make sure all of the thing goes out, only exists if it's subscription-based model because it caters to the users directly and not the companies. Yeah.
Yeah, on one hand you say that consumers have so much power because now they're direct consumers. On the other hand you say, and agree with OG, that social media is so big and people want it. Which one is it?
It's a scale. In your world, there's almost zero to no control by these users because they're not the primary customers. Look, in status quo, if you want to leave Facebook, you can. Facebook doesn't give a shit about you because they're not going to take money from you. But in our world, when it changes, the incentive structures of all these companies change. That is the debate you have to catch on. Third thing, let's talk about how does it breaks monopoly of social media houses. In status quo, if it's advertisement-based model, all of the big advertisement houses are only going to go to one person. That's Facebook. Which is why in social media, it's heavily monopolized by Facebook. Don't be tricked by things like TikTok and Instagram. It's all controlled by Mark Zuckerberg, right? But if you look at in the past when things like MySpace and Friendster were all flood out because of the monopoly that exists in status quo, it also stops things like small businesses, few minority businesses from investing in it. Yeah.
So Facebook's share price was just cut in half because their subscribers has gone down because other companies have been able to break into the market, many of which using this exact.
Okay, so yeah, at best that is something that is ancillary because they lose money when they lose users because the companies, the corporations want to make their users buy into their product. But now there's a direct link. If you think that is good, it's better when there's a direct link between the users and the companies in of itself. So monopoly, I'm not going to give you the argument about why monopoly is something that is bad, but it's something in this better world to live in when individuals have options. You look at all the existing social dating sites that exist in status quo, all the options that exist like Bumble, Coffee Mix, Bagels, and etc. They don't exist in the social media world because of because of advertisement-based model where all the big companies flood towards Facebook and they drown out any and all small more companies entering the market. We think it's better in a world outside government where more companies can exit and enter the market. Individuals have more of a choice. In status quo, if you don't want Facebook, you literally can't be connected to anyone anymore because there's no opt-out clause or opt-out option for you to join any and all companies. So we think in our world, it's a world where you get healthy competition, creative, effective products towards the individuals. If users is the biggest target audience for side or opposition batch, they're not catered to in status quo. It's only side government that protects its individuals' property codes.
I thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the member of opposition.
Is everyone ready? I'm going to start time. So, I think that a lot of the arguments that have been made in this debate crucially miss the link on how this actually changes the world. Because everybody essentially discusses or glosses over the fact that there will be a movement to subscription, and there are some things that everyone uses and some things that no one uses, and so the things that everyone uses will continue to be used. What we're going to do to you is explain a couple of things. First, we're going to explain how the market structure of the technology industry necessarily has to change in this world and would have developed organically and differently. OG said maybe it'll be subscriptions, maybe ISPs will use a cable-based approach, but this is ultimately a THP motion, so we should be making arguments about what that counterfactual actually looks like. We're going to fulfill that purpose. Secondly, then, we're going to explain why this leads to the consolidation of the technology sector. And I want to be clear, yes, there is consolidation in the technology sector right now, but we will explain why the marginal change in competition we get produces a specific change in incentives for technology companies, and why that specific change can better account for all of the negative consequences that you hear in opening bench and handily outweighs whatever you heard from opening opposition. So, firstly, I want to be clear. There is some incentive for tech companies to consolidate on either side of the house for the reason that the technology industry is fundamentally prone to network effects. That is, the biggest reason you use a technological service like a social media, for example, is because other people use it, and the more people use it, the more valuable it is to the n+1 person. This is true for social media. It's also true for things like like search engines, for example, that rely on web crawlers that are made more effective when there are more queries being put into place. So what that necessarily means is that in either world, you end up having, let's say, 80% of web traffic going through less than 100 websites, and in particular, the vast majority going through 5 or 10 websites. That remains the case. However, there is some active counter-pressure to this that exists in the status quo, which is generational replacement within the industry. So that is, even if a company is not going to be able to produce a better version of Facebook called Facebook 2.0, they may be able to compete with Facebook by offering something that is different or more innovative in some kind of unique way. Like right now, TikTok is beating Facebook down by having a new kind of service and a new model to social media, and there have been attempts, for example, to change the web browsing space by having more privacy features, to change the search engine space by having less advertising but still some advertising, and having more anonymity, and these things have produced meaningful competitive pressure on technology companies and have created innovation in the space over time. For context, in the 1990s, 50% of tech stocks were correlated with the Microsoft stock because that was the extent of market power that existed in one company in the technology space. Today, we at least have 5 or 10 companies that have that degree of power instead of one. The problem is, on their side, the mechanism that you need in order for these companies to be profitable in the short term makes the prospect of competition near impossible. So, OO gives like one reason for this, which is that like some people probably cannot afford subscription fees. That's probably true. That's a loss to access that we very much regret. What we're going to say is that it makes it much harder for smaller companies to break in writ large. The reason why is that, like I said, 80% of the exposure people get to the internet will likely come through a small number of services, but there is non-linearity between how much we use a service and how much we are willing to pay for that service. So for example, if I spend 20% of my time on certain websites, then those websites are also getting 20% of the ad revenue from the total amount of time I spend on the internet. But I might not be willing to pay the same amount that I pay for the first 5 websites that I would for the next 15 websites, and therefore, given the choice between spending $15 a month to get access to a core bundle of websites and spending $30 a month to get access to marginally different websites, I probably don't pay that additional dollar because most of the benefits I get from the internet can be substituted away by focusing on a small set of core websites. This will happen specifically because internet service providers will have an incredibly powerful market incentive on their side of the house to collapse net neutrality. If a small number of people want access to a niche segment of the market, but the vast majority of people want access to a core product, then these internet service providers have an incredibly powerful incentive to create a core-based product that is inexpensive, that everyone can access, that gives you access to a few key websites, and then to price the shit out of everything else insofar as the people who do want to access those things have a much stronger and more inelastic preference, and because the marginal cost of administering something at a smaller scale is necessarily likely to be higher. The reason why this does not happen right now is for two reasons. A, there is an incredibly strong norm of the open internet that exists right now. The vast majority of websites that exist in the status quo are not for sale, there is no subscription fee, and people have come to expect that. So if an ISP comes out tomorrow and says, hey, we're going to start charging you to access Facebook, people will be exceptionally angry, and that will be a terrible business decision, but that is necessarily impossible, where every single service has to charge you some amount, so there is a norm that you can pay to play. But secondly, an ad-based model means that companies can sustain themselves without having to be paid through ISPs. So if any one ISP tries to charge you for access, another one can outcompete by not charging you because they can still be profitable while not charging you for access to those websites. But on their side, when every ISP would need to charge you to access these, or you'd have to pay some kind of subscription service, then by definition, there would have to be some kind of charge to access websites, and that means that a small number of websites will get all of the traffic while everyone else gets virtually no traffic and virtually no revenue. Opening.
Yeah, so even if the consolidation somehow happens, and it somehow works in status quo, please weigh that against algorithms that force like ethnic cleansing on people in Myanmar.
About to do that.
Seriously.
Okay, so now we're proving that these 20% will not be able to get traffic, or at least will not be able to get revenue that is proportional to the amount of engagement they would get on our side, which makes it comparatively harder for them to break in. Again, I've made it clear that there will be consolidation in the sector, so not every one of these 20% will break in, but we think that some of them will break in successfully on our side by having some kind of new approach, generational replacement. 3 reasons why this outweighs everything in government bench. First reason why there is less choice among different websites, which is the best link to the kind of bad behavior that should give you on tech companies. The reason why tech companies become accountable is not because of some nebulous notion of regulation from opening opposition. It's because they face competition. So the Myanmar example is incredibly instructive because the reason why Facebook could do what they did there is because they made a profit-sharing deal with the Burmese government that says that on your cell phone, the first website and the only website you will access is Facebook, and when you have no alternative to go to another service, it makes it much more likely that Facebook will mistreat you. Sure.
In an ad-based system where Facebook and other corporations are monopolizing the space, how is it that you can get any of this innovation or technological advancement?
Again, I've already shown that there is generational replacement right now. Consolidation has still gone down since the 1990s, and companies are still churning. But secondly, even if big companies persist on our side, they still behave better because of the threat that they could be replaced by something better. So I'm going to explain that further. Now, there are alternative options that exist right now that at least have some credible chance of breaking in that forces big tech companies to respond. So for example, the advent of things like DuckDuckGo, Mozilla, or Twitter, for example, trying to change its practices so you get less fake news, are all instances where competition can compel big companies to act better, i.e. Google becoming the principal advocate of the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations framework in Europe, because of the threat of competition from more pro-privacy social media services that have a niche market that has the potential to grow over time if they don't do anything about that. We would prefer a world in which in Burma you have access to more social media services than just Facebook, when you can get money not just from a pay-to-play from the government, but from lots and lots of people who all consume lots and lots of ads. Final reason why this is better, it is a better link to all of the innovation benefits that you hear hinted at in opening opposition. When we talk about things like artificial intelligence giving millions of people better access to transportation, to infrastructure, to having information about where to get food and where to get medicine, these things are driven not by just having more money, but by a competitive incentive to be better. That is something we uniquely accomplished on closing opposition. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech and welcome back up.
Judge, I think we need to be really clear in this debate. This debate composes of various levels of stakeholders that we need to prioritize. It is not just technological advancement and innovation that is probably not mutually exclusive because competitive advantage oftentimes already push for this. this debate needs to look at bigger impacts, like as to which methodology or business model actually benefits clients or users on a coherent stage, as well as media companies and social media companies on a bigger scale. I'll explain why exactly our extensions bring closer to that world rather than all other materials in this debate. The structure of my speech is simple. I'm going to deal with every house and tell you why our extensions are debate winning. First, let's talk about closing opposition. Closing opposition's first claim is on innovation, and they give very niche examples of how TikTok is able to strike some balance between advertisements and other niche stuff that I don't understand about. The first response I want to talk about this is that this is very, how do I say, like very convenient in the sense that it's debating in the lens of TikTok, not necessarily other small companies that exist. That's why it's damaging, because all evidence that they've provided so far, all the intuition pumps, is centric upon the big monopolies that exist within the bubble. What about Friendster? What about MySpace? What about Raya and all the other social media companies that exist there? The innovation doesn't exist because there's systematic monopoly that exists with their model. In our world, when we have a subscription-based model, that is when you don't have to rely upon social media companies having advertising companies that want to prioritize them. This is crucial because Pepsi and Coca-Cola probably have no incentive to want to have service with smaller companies because they don't have a lucrative deal at the end of it. So that means the accessibility and the ability for us to democratize the entry point is more likely in our world when people can charge a minimum fee, therefore more smaller companies can enter then. Secondly, they said we would cost everything else and keep it accessible. But the reason why that's not happening is because there's an overarching narrative of people wanting a free internet. That's not true. The reason why that exists is not because of the narrative, but because of the profit incentive of companies. Companies will never make it, it's always based on what they can get at the end of the day, how much money they can make. So any form of compromise with their profits means that they're less likely to be accommodating towards users if they can get more end of the deal from the advertising companies. That means they're always beholden towards the more lucrative deal and they don't owe an obligation towards anyone else. But lastly, they said people will be antagonized. What is the evidence for them to prove why exactly the line of argumentation or the reaction of people will be antagonistic? Especially when we told you, YouTube, that was historically a free service, transitioned to a premium fee. People are actually happy and people are willing to pay for it. Where's the chaos and antagony that happened there? That means to say, we live in a current model world that people will, number one, pay for crazy things. The evidence for that is people can even pay for individuals to queue for you. But secondly, people oftentimes pay for quality service. The fact that a premium membership comes with a laundry list of things that you can get at quality content, people are likely to pay for that, and that means that is something that is great. But two final attacks to really remove closing opposition out of this debate. First is in terms of sustainability. This is important to note because advertising-based model or relying on advertisements is highly volatile for two key reasons. One is it's easily replaceable. At a point in which advertising companies feel we don't want to sponsor this social media company anymore, we want to have a bigger company that's more trending, they'll replace you. Secondly, most products are seasonal, for example. So you can sponsor a certain company right now when your product's probably trendy, but later on it's not. Then what happens? That means advertisements are systematically volatile and it can't be a sustainable pool of income that companies can get. In our world, when it's a subscription-based model, it's a guaranteed pool of income by users that we can get, and that it can also accommodate towards the cost and expenditure that the companies has to provide. That's most certain there. But secondly, technological advancement in all their case can be co-opted by competitive edge. The fact that they're directly competing in an open market, there's always an incentive for them to grow, to edge out over the companies, to be different. We don't think they're exclusive under their world. CEO is out. Before that, I'll take a POI for you to defend yourself from closing.
So, your claim that there isn't innovation in the tech sector right now and like only TikTok is replacing Facebook doesn't deal with the fact that big tech companies spend 5 times more on R&D because they're constantly afraid of competition from smaller companies that could easily replace them.
The response is scale. I think it's important to note that the barrier of entry of companies engaging in the open market heavily incentivizes more R&D and more innovation, but they block that out. All that marginal benefits that they get in terms of R&D is non-comparative towards the insurmountable amount of engagement that we can get when it's open. Let's deal with opening opposition. The first thing that they say is that there's a wider options and they help smaller companies. I think OG won this by saying there are other alternatives towards queer makeup. You don't need social media necessarily for this. But secondly, we think it's important to note that smaller companies can engage in this market much more better in our world when we think a subscription-based model allows them for them to enter the market. So we think on smaller companies, on that contention, we win it because we think the barrier of entry and accessibility is something that they provided. But secondly, they explain why they want to democratize the use of politics and people have to partake in politics. A few responses. First, there are alternatives. Tabloids, newspapers, social media companies, political campaigns, for example. News is also heavily televised. But anyways, I think it's problematic if they want to live in a world where they want social media to be the primary consumer of news. Oftentimes, social media is a room of echo chambers and people can't exchange their opinion because it's heavily centralized in social media algorithm. Don't know where they're getting with politics there. But before that, I'll take a POI from you as well.
Yeah, when companies want more subscribers, what are they more likely to do? Just get them addicted through sensationalized news or actually cater to their needs per your extension?
Your nuance as to why people are likely, or social media companies want to make things interesting is already enough incentive for us to show that people will join the market in the first place. I don't see why the incentive changes at a point in which you change the business subscription model. But finally, on the idea of capitalism ideals, because they explain that although they said a good government team would argue against the fact that capitalism is something that is indoctrinating and it's bad, but people want it. If it's true that people oftentimes do subscribe towards capitalist ideals, that proves our point that people will pay for a subscription fee based on capitalistic ideals. So OO is out. Why do we win this debate out of OG? OG has a good case in terms of privacy and in terms of fake news and why that's bad. But 3 reasons why we edge over them. First is, we're contextualized more towards this debate in terms of business model. Because fake news and privacy happens in both worlds and you harvest and sell data everywhere. But at least ours is more nuanced into talking about why exactly this business model is more preferable. Secondly, our magnitude of impact is better. Because we have salient impacts towards both stakeholders in both the business model of the companies as well as users, because they're more user-friendly and because they're more answerable and accountable at a point in which it's a transactionary relationship. But finally, it's a more thorough case in terms of explaining why exactly users will be benefited out of this, and it's able to create a much better space for all of them. For all those reasons, vote CG.
I'd thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the off whip.
Devesh explains to you how, mechanistically speaking, tech companies previously had one reason to stay accountable, and that was the constant fear of competition and the fact that the new tech company rising to power only takes a simple action. It's the downloading of a new app or typing in a new URL. But when the government side changes this into a completely new paywall, a complete shift off of the interdependent ecosystem that has been created by subscription-based websites, or if it's changing your ISP plan halfway through the year, cancellation fees, etc., all of these huge barriers of access are the very reason why smaller companies, tech websites, etc. have zero chance of ever succeeding on their side. And the fact that their response to all of the millions of dollars being put into R&D for the fear of competition was just, but the status quo looks quite bleak right now, just shows their lack of imagination in really conceptualizing how much worse this internet service could have looked like and the counterfactual that we should be regretting now. So I'm gonna go through this debate, firstly addressing the government teams, and then I'll explain to you why Devesh's arguments pretty much encase all of the impacts that they want to talk about, but also weigh over OO. So the first thing I want to do is talk about government side. OG and CG, I think, had quite similar lines of analysis when it comes to the incentive structures that are likely going to shift in their minds, right? They tell us that the shifts from advertisers to consumers is likely going to reach some type of nirvana that all of of a sudden allows for customers to have much more leverage and change things that happen. But I don't think they really actually fully conceptualize what this shift actually looks like. Because I don't think subscription services are going to be as easy as we bait them in, they pay one time, and then they forget about their subscription service for the rest of time, right? I think what is more likely going to happen is that many of the incentives stay the same. I think OO is correct to point out how data is still going to be useful, and it's still going to be like harvested, used, and sold on either side of the house. But I think what's also important is the fact that like most of these subscription services are probably going to implement things like tiered paywall systems or premium subscriptions. That means that they still have the exact same demands that like opening government wants to talk about in terms of sensationalizing news, increasing engagement to make sure that they have some sort of customer retention, right? Just note that all of the revenue models, if you really think about them, work through different mechanisms but follow the exact same lines of logic. I think the only independent thing that then comes out of opening government that's their last leg to stand on is this idea of politics. I think the issue here comes twofold. Firstly, note that both gov teams argue that there is no accountability for tech companies. Sure, but if this is true, then the only incentive for them to change is facing competition from other services that do it better. And the best example, and their best example of Burma, is a case where there is no competition for Facebook that led to the ability to monopolize the entirety of social media and access towards alternative ideas over the internet. The second thing to note here is that many instances of change, like privacy regulation, fake news regulation, etc., arose from competitive pressure between tech companies like Facebook and Twitter and Google and Mozilla. The fact that there exists these large enough companies that can create some sort of like a pseudo oligopoly is the result of having any mechanisms of competition that don't exist on their side. The last thing to just mention here is like this is probably an argument that is extremely marginal. Competition is a much better incentive to make them behave better. If they have a monopoly and get their fees from Comcast every year no matter what, then they will keep acting in bad ways that are still profitable right now. Now, before I move on to a few independent points from closing government, I'll take your point.
So on your point on competition in and of itself, can you please analyze and engage how is it that in the dating app when it's subscription based, there's a lot more competitions compared to social media when it's ad based?
No, well, I'm just saying like dating apps have competition just simply because of how much demand there is for them. But when it comes to when it comes to the apps that you're talking about, when it comes to providing subscription services, like the comparative amount of competition is drastically going to be reduced just simply because of how difficult it is to engage in them. And this is also why even dating apps, even though that they can provide like vastly different services, oftentimes aren't able to outcompete each other, even though they don't even have the exact same end goals in mind. So then I want to deal with a couple of the independent arguments coming from closing government, right? I think the first thing that they tell us is like a lot of times the advertisement space is easily dominated by bigger companies because they are able to buy out the advertisement slots. I think the issue here is that they don't really deal with the comparative, right? Because I think traditional advertising spaces are even more so dominated by bigger companies, and the only spaces in which like niche markets are ever going to be accessed are probably through internet services. This last thing that I want to quickly deal with then is that they tell us, consumers can now use subscription as a leverage. I think the issue that they fail to realize is that the leverage is already in the hands of the consumers, even if they are not the ones actively giving the dollar to these tech companies. At the end of the day, it's the viewership of the individuals being on these websites that gives them any power whatsoever when it comes to being able to deal with these tech companies. I'll take a point from opening.
Yeah, so all of your analysis about consolidation is undercut by the fact that sites can choose to be free for a certain amount of time, running at a loss in order to capture market share, as many companies do, and later starting to charge a fee, which is how newcomers will be able to break in and are counterfactual. Monopolization is marginal. What matters is the content those companies are incentivized to promote.
I would agree with that in theory, but the issue is, as Devesh explained to you and like completely dropped in government whip, is that ISPs are going to be a much preferable model and the most likely counterfactual just simply because of the stability that they present to you, right? The fact that you can arrange a deal with an internet service provider that guarantees a stable source of income rather than relying on what even government admits is a very variable subscription-based model probably means that the vast majority of internet access is going to be dependent on which package you select through your ISP, which means that then smaller websites have literally no chance of going in. But even if it is true that that ISPs don't dominate these markets, what is more likely going to happen is that because people have the understanding that going to a new website entails future subscription models, they won't even give them the light of day in the first place because there's no point in trying. So lastly then, why is it that we weigh against OO and beat them there as well? I think the first thing to point out is that we give a much better link to the accountability that OO assumes as fiat, right? We think that government or corporate self-regulation is extremely unlikely under monopoly, but the fact that we're the only team that can actually address what it is in the status quo that gives a breaking point for those for the monopolization of these industries means that we give the stronger link compared to OO. I think the second thing here is that OO's biggest impact is people getting slightly better products from advertisers. I think this is a benefit, but kind of marginal when it compares to all of the arguments that Devesh gave you, right? Like when it comes to the impacts, like millions of people being benefited by technological innovation in artificial intelligence. For example, state governments all over the US using AI to literally find and remove lead from water pipes. Like the amount of money that is being funneled into R&D that oftentimes has like byproducts that benefit the millions of people around the world is something that just should not be understated. The change in social media accountability and impacts on democracy that we get from competition, all of these impacts severely outweigh any other houses around. I'm very proud to.